Hey guys, just wanted to shoot you guys a quick reminder on the stuff we covered in class on Monday. Don't forget the sheets I handed you. You can use your book. Your book does explain the difference in how to convert, again, decimals to fractions, fractions to decimals, decimals to percents, percents to decimals. Again, fractions and ratios are the same thing, so we remember that. I'm just going to walk you guys through just a couple of those instead of just explaining it. So starting with kind of an easy one. Let's just say I give you the fraction, let's say 1/4. 1/4 is kind of easy. It's one we're pretty familiar with. I can really do two things with fractions. I know how to convert a fraction to a decimal. Okay. I also know how to convert a fraction to a ratio. Fractions to ratios are super easy. Remember, fraction to ratio, fractions and ratios are pretty much the same thing. They're just written a little bit differently. Fraction being 1/4, that would make our ratio 1 to 4. We just simply separate them with a colon rather than a line. That's the only difference. When we have a proper fraction, we have our ratio. Same thing. They're just read a little bit differently. Fraction is 1/4, while ratio would be read as 1 to 4. 1 to 4. With fractions, we also know how to convert our fractions to decimals, and that was really easy. Remember, that's just kind of almost like you're reading this fraction down. I'm taking 1 and then dividing it by 4. So reading it as just as it says, as 1 divided by 4. So reading that down, that's what I mean by that. 1 divided by 4, if I did that, do it in your calculator to save yourself the time. You don't have to do this by hand. 1 divided by 4, when you punch that into your calculator, you'll notice that that gives you 0.25, 0.25. Do get in the habit of putting that 0 there, guys. Again, like I told you all, when you get into your nursing classes, they are looking for that 0. So any number that's smaller than 1, make sure we put that 0 in front of it there. Now with our decimal is how we're going to get to our percent. Decimals to percent, remember, technically to go from decimal to percent, we are multiplying by 100. Well, when we multiply by 100, technically that's the same thing as taking this decimal point and moving it 2 places to the right. Decimal to percent is always 2 places to the right. So when that happens, that puts our decimal right there behind the 5, and that makes it 25%. So there are our three answers. Our decimal is 0.25, our fraction is 1/4, our percent is 25%, and our ratio is 1/4. A little bit easy. Okay, let's find one that maybe isn't as easy. Let's say we have, let me erase these here. Let's say now I have the decimal. Let's start with the decimal. I'm going to start with the decimal 0. Let's say 375. Okay, a little bit bigger of a decimal. Whoops. Okay, so 0.375. So now what I'm doing, I can do a couple things with this. Decimal to fraction, I know how to do that. I know also how to convert a decimal to a percent. I do not know how to take a decimal to a ratio. I can't get to my ratio until I have my fraction, so that has to be done first. So we can eliminate that. Easy probably would be to convert decimal to percent. Like we saw in the last example, decimal to percent is simply just a decimal movement of 2 places to the right. So when we do that, that puts that decimal right there between the 7 and the 5. So writing that as a percent would simply be 37.5%. Remember, that's always 2 places to the right. If I was going in the opposite direction, so say if I gave you this 37.5% first, to go back to a decimal, it would simply just be a movement of 2 places to the left, which is why we end up with, there you go, 0.375. So that's how we can convert back and forth to those. So with that being said, now I need to convert my decimal to a fraction. Now remember, and I'm just going to do this down here at the bottom so we have a little bit more room. Whenever I have a decimal, in order to convert that to a fraction, what I have to do is take that decimal and move it as many times as I need to get to the end of that number. Doesn't matter if it's only 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, it could be 4 sometimes. But I want to move it to the end. With that being said, in this particular example, it takes us 3 decimal movements. So what that means is that turns this into the whole number 375. By moving it to the very far right, that's what we've just done, is we turned it into a whole number. That becomes our numerator. The denominator is then based on that decimal movement. And remember, like we said in class, your denominator, whenever you move a decimal, you're always moving it by 10. So meaning one place being 10, two places being 100, three places being 1,000. So that's what our denominator is going to be, but the easiest way to remember that is the number of times you move your decimal is the number of zeros that is going to be in your denominator starting off. So it's always going to be a 1, and then again, because there were 3 movements, it's 1, 2, 3 zeros. Now it's just a matter of reducing 375 over 1,000. So taking that, a couple times, you're going to have to start with, you could start with 5, you can start with 25, you could really start with 125 here, but just practice. Practice reducing. This just goes back to reducing our fractions. And in this case, they can both be divided by 5. They can both be divided by, like I said, 25. If we started with 25, 375 divided by 25, and I'm just going to kind of show you what I did here, gives me 15. Therefore, what I have to do is I have to divide the bottom by 25 as well, and that gives me 40. 1540 can be reduced again because both of those can be also divided by 5. 15 divided by 5 gives me 3. 40 divided by 5 gives me 8. 3/8 cannot be reduced any further. Therefore, my fraction answer up here is 3/8. So 3/8 being my fraction, again, that makes my ratio simply just 3:8. So I have filled in my 4 answers here. Again, just given that one, I have filled out the other 3. Okay, let's take a look at one more for our decimal to fraction to percent to ratio. Let's say, again, recalling if I have a number in front of my fraction, so just real quickly, just explaining that. Earlier we saw the fraction 1/4, and we know that that's 0.25 from our example earlier. If, however, that wasn't just 1/4, what if that was 7 1/4? What that means, the number that's in front of my fraction, that simply just becomes the number that's in front of my decimal. So I know 1/4 being 0.25, that simply makes this 7.25. What happens is when there's a whole number in front, on the previous example there wasn't a whole number, which made that 0.25. But since there is something in front of that fraction now, that just simply becomes the number in front of my decimal. So that being said, let's look at one similar to that. Let's say we have, hang on, let me erase all this here. Let's say we have the fraction, let's say 5.5. Okay, so I'm given the fraction 5.5. Again, with fractions, I can do two things. I can take a fraction, convert it to a decimal, and a fraction and convert it to a ratio. Let's look at that decimal first, because we just looked at something like that. Again, remember when I have a number in front of my fraction, that becomes the number in front of my decimal. So that means since 5 is in front of that 1/2, I know it's going to be 5 point something. So that 1/2 is what I have to divide in my calculator. And remember, fraction to decimal is top divided by bottom. So 1 divided by 2 in my calculator will give you 0.5. But that 5 that's in front is going to replace that 0. So my decimal here is going to be 5.5. Okay, so now that we have our decimal, I should be able to get my percent, because remember, decimal to percent is simply just a movement of 2 places to the right. I've got an empty spot here, so what I have to do is I'm going to end up having to fill that in with a 0. So that makes my percent 550%. I simply just filled in this spot right here with a 0. Okay? Now my ratio. Remember, fractions are ratios. So earlier when I had the fraction by itself, 1/4, my ratio was 1:4. But whenever I have a mixed fraction, like the one I have right here, this now is a little bit different because I've got 3 numbers. And a ratio must always be 2 numbers separated by a colon. So it should be something to something. So what I have to think about is, how do I turn 5.5 to just 2 numbers? Right now it's 3. It's got a 5, a 1, and a 2. Thinking back to our multiplication and division of fractions, that is exactly what we did in order to multiply fractions. We had to turn that into an improper fraction, and that's what we're going to have to do here. So what we're going to have to do in this particular instance is take my 5, multiply it by 2, and then add the 1, because that will give me the improper fraction 11 over 2. So now that I just have two numbers, I now have my ratio. My ratio is simply 11 to 2. So there are my 4 answers. I started with the fraction 5.5, which gave me the decimal 5.5, which then gave me the percent 550%, which then gave me the ratio 11 to 2. I hope that helps, guys. I will send you a separate video on our metrics as well, so expect that soon.